Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Cinderella gets a bloody twist in Shudder's Norwegian horror film, The Ugly Stepsister. In the magical kingdom of Swedlandia, Elvira and Alma, played by Leah Myron and Flo Fagerelli, accompany their mother Rebecca, played by Andal Top, as she marries Otto, played by Ralph Carlson, who has a beautiful daughter named Agnes, played by Tia Sophia Lackneis. When Otto dies suddenly, they realise that he's penniless, and the family's only hope is for one of the daughters to marry Prince Julian, played by Isaac Conroth. Elvira is determined to do so, but in order to try and succeed instead of Agnes, she will go to extreme lengths. The Ugly Stepsister is the feature directorial debut of Emily Bleakfeld and is partially inspired by her own struggles with body image, especially in her teenage years. It comes at a time where fairy tales are very much being revisited and updated, especially by Disney themselves, to cash in on their earlier animated versions in live action form. And in the modern day, those Disneyfied versions are how we commonly think of fairy tales, as being gentle, family-friendly, mostly moral stories, mainly for children. But those fairy tales are often folklore that's been told, reiterated, and adapted for centuries. And that's true of Cinderella, which has had various versions and variations which are far more violent and cruel than the wish fulfillment story we largely think of it as, especially so for the Brothers Grimm version, which The Ugly Stepsister is specifically inspired by, and takes the nastiness of that take and cranks it up even further. Cinderella might be one of the most commonly told stories of all time, and there's been countless versions in every flavour you can think of, but even some of the more recent adaptations have tried to address some of the criticisms about the story, namely that Cinderella herself is quite a passive character. That's more critique of the Disney version in specific, although the wildly awful Camila Cabello musical version, with its girl boss take on the character, is probably a swing too much in the opposite direction. God, having to remember James Corden as a CGI mouse is almost more horrifying than anything in The Ugly Stepsister, and that's really saying something. But a more general complaint is that the story inherently values virtue by appearance. Cinderella is a good person, and therefore is pretty, and the step family are ugly because they are bad. And it's a very caricatured logic, because the Cinderella we know is a simple story that can form the basis of a harmful internal logic in a person. If I'm a good person, why am I not outwardly beautiful? And given how often we try to find new angles on familiar stories, it genuinely surprises me it's taken until now to have a version which tells the story from the point of view of the stepsister on film. And The Ugly Stepsister isn't a Maleficent-esque spin that turns the villain into a misunderstood anti-hero. It drags the tale, kicking and screaming, into the complexities of the adult world, deconstructs it, and then splatters Cinderella's dress with blood. But what it tries to do is find empathy in the archetype, and when we meet stepsister Elvira, there's a distinctly childlike quality to her despite being 18 years old, with her teeth already in braces and her hair in curls. Elvira comes across as naive in a way which immediately signals how sheltered and repressed life under her mother has likely been, that she hasn't really grown up, and her first glimpse at Agnes immediately makes her feel uncomfortable. It instantly sets up the dynamic between them, as she looks at Agnes, who seems so much more mature and womanly than Elvira, and judges her for it. Agnes is the ideal that Elvira wants to be, and just being in her presence is enough to feel inadequate. And she may be this film's version of Cinderella, but Agnes is far from a perfect person. She feels that these people are not fit to marry her father, and when he dies, she harshly rebukes Elvira for trying to console her by comparing the loss of each other's fathers. Of course, the fact that Elvira is playing with her hairbrush, a passive symbol of wanting to be Agnes, probably doesn't help matters. But once the prince starts looking for a bride, the whole film becomes a competition, and a comment on the way that society often pits women against each other, literally so as everyone is trying to win the prince's affections, and especially his wealthy inheritance. Elvira and Agnes function as mirror images of each other in many ways, and this is a version where both of these characters are both victims and perpetrators of cruelty in their own right. When Elvira declares that she intends to marry the prince, her mother laughingly scoffs at her, but then quickly sets about trying to transform her into the ideal suitress, as if Cronenberg directed My Fair Lady. She's enrolled in a finishing school, ostensibly to teach her manners and grace, but it's mostly a series of constant humiliations by Madame Wagner, played by Katarzyna Hermann, who makes clear that the only reason she's keeping her around is because her mother is paying for it, and not because she can actually fulfill her ambitions. Elvira's awkwardness and lack of finesse is singled out. In particular, there's moments where Wagner puts her right at the back of the class, but it is particularly clear against the entire class of well-trained, well-to-do women who are all after exactly the same thing. But the most prominent element is Elvira's mother taking her to see Dr. Aesthetic, played by a wonderfully grotesque Adam Lundgren, for some primitive early surgeries, and the body horror is in high gear in these scenes, with all the tools shot like instruments of torture. Because they are, pretty much. There's a very darkly comic edge to much of what's going on in the film, but that still won't stop audiences absolutely flinching at the agonisingly painful techniques, from a hammer-inflicted nose job that requires Elvira to spend much of the first half in a velvet-laced brace to set it on her nose, almost like she's being Frankensteined into shape. There's a later moment where Elvira has false eyelashes stitched on, and I'm not really a fan of eye trauma at the best of times, and I genuinely had to look away during the latter scene as the camera focuses on the hook going through the eyelid in these tight macro close-ups. It's skin-crawling stuff. It's designed to make you feel uncomfortable, but that's the point, because this is an absolutely brutal critique of beauty standards and the dangerous, disturbing lengths that people go to try and think what is the best version of themselves, especially when you consider that historically things like makeup contained things that were actually poisonous for people. And there's nothing really wrong with Elvira to start off with, but she's desperate to try and conform, determined to jam a square peg into a round hole. The more pressure she places herself to succeed, the more she internalises these harmful expectations, and the more her self-hatred drives her. She keeps repeating the mantra through the film, beauty is pain, that enough suffering will mean that she gets her reward, even though we know that her chances for a happy ending are very unlikely. Elvira likes her cakes, but she also hates her shape, so in a stunningly gross subplot, she ingests a tapeworm egg, resulting in numerous instances of squelchy, gurgling stomach noises that are a constant source of tension. There is something literally growing inside of her that is very unpleasant, and rot is a major visual motif through the film. The opening credits play over Otto's corpse on a table of decaying food as the camera pans over it, and Rebecca refuses to pay for a funeral for him and uses all the money to fund Elvira's transformation, so she just leaves his corpse in a room to decompose somewhere. But that rot is in Elvira, both figuratively and literally. The closer she becomes to being the beautiful person she wants to be, the one that she imagines in her juvenile fantasy sequences where she imagines her happily ever after, the harder it becomes to maintain, and the more it is destroying her in every sense. And by the time it comes to the most notorious moments of the grim version, you'll be watching through your fingers as you just want this poor girl to stop punishing herself. As I said, it is very blackly funny, but it's also deeply tragic, and because the movie invites you to step into Elvira's shoes, it's hard not to feel sad for her, rather than most other versions which see what happens to her as a fitting punishment. But there's also an allegory for adolescence in Elvira's transformation as well, in this quick attempt to move from being a child to being an adult, and the embarrassment and unpleasantness of navigating that change. That sense of social ostracization feels like it's very much drawn from the director's own experiences, and I did personally relate to that as someone whose own teenage years were very difficult and still leave plenty of scars, to be honest. But that's also accompanied by a burgeoning awareness of sexuality, and that is a marked difference between Elvira and Agnes, as her romantic fantasies are of a chase storybook kind. Agnes, however, is already sexually active because this Cinderella is not a virgin. She's having a secret affair with a stable boy, and when Elvira stumbles upon them in the act, it's very explicit. There's some proper 18 certificate rated close-ups, and it serves as a culture shock for Elvira that she's both disgusted by it but also a bit jealous of it at the same time. And there is this idea that this cross-cultural relationship is actually what Agnes wants, that her attempt to get the prince is mostly to secure financial independence away from her stepfamily and not out of romance. But that thread is kind of left hanging after the stable boy exits the film. And the prince is not exactly a catch in this version, as you'd probably expect, as he and his entourage are crass, leering, judgmental slimes in their own right, snickering remarks like, "I wouldn't want to F that." But the men are largely kept to the side in this version, as it largely focuses on how women uphold their standards upon each other. But Elvira isn't the only character going through an adolescence. Her younger sister Alma is just about to start her own, as she has her first period during the events of the film. But far from being cruel like her sister, as in other incarnations, Alma might be the character with the clearest eyes about both her mother's cruelty, but also her sister's increasingly unhealthy attitudes, saying directly to her that she has a sickness of the mind. And she's not wrong, she sees them for what they are. Alma has a small arc running on the sidelines of the film, but she's the one that grows up the most of the two sisters into someone ultimately assertive and rejects the toxic values of where the story takes place. Agnes, meanwhile, largely runs through the typical trappings of the Cinderella story, be it shamed and humiliated by her stepmother, or having her luxury stripped away and forced to do menial work. But even as she loses her class while Elvira ascends in her own status, Agnes, in true Cinderella fashion, never loses her beauty or generally sunny attitude. Even as she sings to herself while milking the cows, Elvira might be looking down upon her, but she is still envious of her. Agnes is what the world wants girls to be, and the world bends towards her even when she's down, and that's something that even Elvira cannot attain. So when Bleakfeld uses elements of the Cinderella story, incorporating bits and pieces from various incarnations, she does so with a sense of magical realism, at once in keeping with the familiar images and story beats, while covering them in muck and mess, like the beleaguered heroine before her transformation. So you have this image of the torn up dress being repaired, but done so by silkworms who stitch the pieces together, and that extends to the whole film, which has a wonderfully gothic candlelit look in keeping with the darker edges of classic fairy tales, but also grand and opulent in the key sequence in the ball, marked with splashes of dark claret. The whole film is both beautiful and brutal simultaneously. It evokes the sense of a classic painting or tapestry in its combination of the two. The score by Kada and Vilde Tuv is also really memorable, reimagining classical themes with pop synths, which gives a very modern edge to old tradition that is almost punky and countercultural, and it fits the twisted tone of the film like a perfectly sized slipper. The Ugly Stepsister is not for the squeamish, to put it mildly, but I thought it did an excellent job of subverting and sending up the classic Cinderella story and finding complexities in the original story's simple messages. It actively wants to make the audience feel uncomfortable as it rebukes beauty standards and all the messaging that girls have to be pretty and nice by focusing on the gross, disgusting and the nasty, daring you to look away. And in that way, it very much evokes Caroline Forshaw's The Substance, which did much the same thing and was one of my favourite films of last year. And even the trailer for The Ugly Stepsister evokes that movie's promotional materials. I thought of The Substance as being like a grotesque comedy, and it feels like a contemporary fairy tale. And while The Ugly Stepsister might not go quite as far as the unforgettable fire hose finale of The Substance, it is still extreme. But I don't really want to pit these two movies against each other, especially not discussing a film about the unfair competition between women, because really the two films complement each other and have similar ideas. They would make for a particularly confrontational double feature, and if you enjoyed The Substance, definitely give this a go. But moreover, this is an excellent debut feature for Emily Bleakfeld that proves the enduring power of the story that it's based on and how truly malleable it is. And while some people might get irrationally angry about supposedly ruining classic fairy tales, despite the fact they have constantly changed through history, it is always important to tell them in different ways, even if they don't always work. And hey, if you don't like a version, don't worry, a different narrator is always right around the corner. And with Bleakfeld's own perspective on it, she doesn't tarnish the Cinderella legend, she enriches it. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can be my fairy godmother over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe. It all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.